The Juneau World Affairs Council, in collaboration with KTOO, presents the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. In this session, The Nature of Authoritarian Movements, a panel discussion on why and under what conditions are citizens attracted to authoritarian movements, are there elements that all authoritarian movements share, and do authoritarian movements shape or are they shaped by events?
Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to start today with the question that was foremost in my mind when I started thinking about this forum, and the one that all of you addressed in one way or another in your presentations yesterday. And I hope we can extend those conversations today in an open roundtable type discussion. So the question is, why do some citizens in an open, free, and democratic society turn to authoritarian movements and leaders to solve their problems rather than through the democratic process and institutions set up within the society? And I want to turn to Mark, who had a question yesterday that really connected with that, which is that he suggested that the reason some individuals may not do that is that their allegiance is not to the society at all and its diverse cultures and within it, because all of our modern democratic societies are multicultural, multi-religious, multi-value cultures. And what he suggested, very briefly, was that there may be reasons that some people give their allegiance to subgroups within the society instead of the society at all. And therefore, they don't really see the need for the democratic processes to resolve the differences in society because they already have chosen where they stand. And Mark, did I understand your suggestion correctly? And would you kind of kick us off in discussing that?
Sure, happy to, Geron. Since I was tasked with talking about religion and the role of religion in the sort of thinking about how authoritarian movements and governments work, the simplest and straightforward thing is that for people who have strong religious commitments, that's where their commitment is. It may not even be to other subgroups other than their co-religionists. But if you think that the most important thing for people is to get life eternal, then you're going to, be tempted anyway to advance that cause over democratic decision making. Now, there are religious traditions, and particularly the sort of very strong individualist Protestant traditions that contributed, in marked ways to the founding of this country, where people really see individuals having to make up their own minds. And that does dovetail with certain kinds of democratic decision making, but that's far from how many religious communities and organizations see themselves in society. So, I'll leave it at that for now and see how that works with other members of the panel.
I can continue. So, we live in multicultural societies, multi-religious. There are so many differences within each society, complex. We live in very complex societies with immigration and everything. But I think that level of social difference doesn't need to create polarization, They only do it because our political leaders articulate things in a way that make people see those differences as non-breachable, right? So that political articulation is very, very important. Because there were, you know, in the previous times when we didn't have these populist leaders, I mean, like, we can go back to Ottoman Empire or other empires. I mean, these were like very like pluralistic structures, like societies, and they somehow managed to live together. I mean, there were also religious wars and this and that, but it's like, I think at the level of political articulation that these differences become a problem or divisive in societies. So religion in itself, you know, we can live in multi-religious societies, and we do, but at some point we start to see, you know, different religions as kind of the other, right? The other, we start to see them the other in and not really good our own political goals or what our sort of idea of a good society. So I think I blame the politicians and the political discourse.
Some people have described American society in these polarizations as tribalism. I don't like that term. I think it obscures more than it clarifies, and I would really like to see thinkers and the media and politicians and society at large drill down deeper into what is going on. And I liked what you said, Ayça, is that it's nothing innate in humanity or innate in, and that's the problem I have with tribalism. If it's all tribalism, well, that's baked in, that's the way humans were, there's nothing you can do about it, we're doomed, etc. And I don't accept that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Peter had a discussion in his talk about, you know, whether this is innate, to what extent, and I love the examples that you gave with chimpanzees and the other, I can't remember the exact kind. Bonobos, yeah. So we could go either way. I mean, the innateness or the tribal sort of sense we have could be channeled in a different direction. Maybe you could remind us that example.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that human nature is pliable. It's not totally pliable. I mean, like I said yesterday, I think there is a fundamental democratic impulse, or there's a fundamental impulse that everybody has for some kind of reciprocity. People know when something is oppressive, there's a sense. But the social system can shape the personality. And I think part of the problem you've got, at least in the United States specifically, is that it's a culture that's highly individualistic, that from elementary school or really early on, I think there's lessons that are taught from our economic system, which basically tell people that life is a zero-sum game. You know, you're made to feel good when somebody else fails. You know, I mean, I hate to say that, it sounds nasty, but I think, I mean, for example, when kids are second graders in a math class and the teacher goes, hey, what's 2 + 2? And all the kids are raising their hand, and the first kid gets it wrong. What's the response of the other kids? They raise their hands higher. And so what's being taught here, it's not just mathematics, it's also sort of rewarding individualism at the expense of solidarity. So the social system shapes the personality. But the other thing that I'm thinking about here is that we've had this decline of civic associations. You know, so you've got a base level of individualism and competitiveness. We always talk, even the politicians are always talking about, we have to compete with China, we got to compete with this. How are your kids going to compete? You got to be a tiger mom, get your kids out there. You know, you got that going on, but at the same time, America's such a young country in some ways. It's not like, say, Western Europe or Japan, where you have, it's kind of understood you've got a background, a consensual background that people are coming out of that just kind of, here it's not. So when you have things breaking down, whether it's church, union, civic associations, you're left with a bunch of isolated people, and you combine that with the sort of modern isolated electronic sphere that we're all immersed in. And you got a bunch of isolated people. You throw a little economic stress on top of that, where people don't know are my kids going to be able to go to college? What's going to happen? No one cares about me. These other groups got favored over me. It can make a very contentious, even though we're a multicultural society, the possibilities of contentiousness are very high. I mean, in some ways, I would say, in terms of democracy, that America really wasn't a full political democracy until the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s. So yeah, we're new, and we have to stay on top of this. And I'm interested to watch Europe, because Europe has had, in terms of immigration, they dwarf the United States in terms of the influx of people, even with all the issues going on at the American southern border. I mean, you look at all the refugees from the Middle East that are flooding into different countries in Europe. So I don't know. There's some differences between the U.S. and Europe, definitely, but I just feel like when you lose that sense of belonging in a particular group, then you have this desire for this longing for being immersed in this hypothetical group that's being presented to you. I mean, here I'm thinking maybe you could think about the MAGA phenomena, for example. There's a new identity being created, and you want to identify with that, even if it's not really a face-to-face group. I'm throwing a lot of material out there. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
I'll add something. In the case of Latin America, I think of the recent experience of El Salvador and how they elected President Bukele. And I think of Nicaragua almost 2 decades ago. I can think of Brazilians when they elected Bolsonaro. And you notice that there is a strong discontent with how democracy has been delivering, and disenchantment, especially from the young people. And I think what's curious, you talked a little bit about this in your talk, was we see a lot of authoritarian leaders that use democracy to get to where they are, and democracy is not delivering. And in the case of El Salvador, people are now happy, even though, because President Bukele came and he said we have a huge issue, our people can't walk down the streets without getting shot, and people have been willing to give up some civil liberties in order to have the freedom of movement, in order to be able to walk to the mall or walk to the convenience store. And just hearing your comments, I'm also reminded of a few years ago, I was having a conversation with a former Latin American head of state, and she was saying when she visited China that some members of the party said, the problem with democracy is that it takes time. And that's why, we don't, China is not a democracy. And I'm just very intrigued by authoritarian leaders use democracy to get to where they are, and then they dismantle it. And we're seeing in Latin America that again, going back to El Salvador, people are fine with that. They're fine with 100,000 of their countrymen and women being in jail because, some of them are criminals, but not all of them. And they're fine with giving up. They now have these speed trials where they put 800 people on trial, and they have a lawyer has 4 to 5 minutes to present the case for all 800 people, many of whom are wrongfully convicted, incarcerated. So, but the country's thriving now, and these questions of individualism and being unhappy. And yesterday you also talked about the Gini coefficient and inequality, and in MAGA I also see how it could resonate with many people who've been left behind, that things are unfair, and we need sort of this leader, messianic leader, who's going to come and make things right for all of us.
I mean, we do come down to cases, and I think one of the things to keep in mind about the United States is that when the sort of conservative religious movement began in the late 1970s as a sort of, at least in considerable degree, protest against social changes ranging from women's rights and gay rights and civil rights to some degree, and the abortion decision, there was a kind of presumption which was baked into the names that they took. It was the moral majority. It was, we are the majority of the silent majority of Richard Nixon, and that somehow there was a belief that if you could just activate the majority, that democratic decision making would take care of that. That has proven not to be the case. We're seeing that today with, majorities wanting to have, a right to abortion in very red states. And so there's a frustration then that the democratic process, which you had depended on, that was going to deliver the goods in terms of your movement, proved not to be there. And then the question is, do you on procedural grounds say, well, I guess most Americans want to have a right to choose, I'm giving, we're going to accept that, or do you find workarounds? Do you get a Supreme Court which will force people not to have a right to choose because that's your position and you've got the right Supreme Court justices and so on? So I think the agendas of large minorities, when they're not met by the democratic process, can lead members of those minorities to say, well, maybe democracy isn't so good. And incidentally, I mean, the shoe may be on the other foot for all the people who are anti-Trump. If it turns out in a few weeks that Donald Trump is elected president, concerns about problems with democracy are going to be, among progressives, because, how could a majority of Americans, or at least the Electoral College, have that result?
To bring it back for a second to something Maria just said, the compromise that people were willing to make in post-Soviet Russia in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economy had fallen out, people were disillusioned with the democratic building project, was basically that we're willing to give up civil liberties, voting rights, for the right to eat, the right to work, to have IKEA furniture, to take vacations in Western Europe once in a while, and that was all cool until the shoe dropped and those things were no longer available, and ordinary Russians were cut off from the rest of the world because of the regime's decision to invade its neighbor.
So it comes time to, at some point you have to pay the piper. I mean,
yeah, for sure.
And in a way, I mean, there may come a time when in El Salvador, there are too many people unfairly, unjustly locked up, and people will say, maybe this wasn't so good.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, yesterday when Tyler was talking about prison population in Russia, I mean, I was thinking, you know, the United States, we're number one. I mean, in terms of developed countries, in terms of imprisonment. I was looking at the numbers. I think we're somewhere between 500 and 700 per 100,000, and the Russians are far below that. But you know, we don't think about that as indicating. It's a fact that we don't foreground in terms of when we think about America. You know, just like we don't think about that one graph that showed the distribution of wealth in the United States, where 50% of the population has almost nothing. You know, it's just, and you tie that in with the social disintegration that we take for granted in the United States. The shootings. I mean, I think that's the leading cause of death for young men now in the United States. But we just treat it like it's just a fact that we have to work around, and we don't ask the question, well, why do we have so many more shootings in the United States than, say, Western Europe? I mean, Western Europe, periodically something will happen in Norway or some other place, maybe in Scotland or something, and it'll be treated like a huge scandal. Whereas, but it says something about the social disintegration that's going on between the prison, the incarceration, which increased, what was it, 4 times, it was quadrupled in 4 times between 1980 and 2000. At the same time, we're seeing this separation of the population. I mean, I just think that part of what's happening is that there's always been these anxieties within the population. But it's sort of like the separation of wealth in the United States adds fuel to that pot of boiling water. You know, things that are already in motion. And then you put on top of that the fact that you've got this class struggle going on in the United States. You know, yesterday I was looking at the Lewis Powell memo from 1971. He was a later Supreme Court justice. He was appointed by Nixon. And he wrote a very influential memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in 1971. And it was in the wake of what you talk about in terms of the uprisings in the 1960s. And he basically said, we have to retake this country for the interest of our class, the business class. And he specifically went through and said, we got to go after the educational system. We got to go after people like Ralph Nader. We've got to get this thing back under control. And so you have this class that then figures out, well, how are we going to get the majority of the population to push with that agenda? And they're looking at these schisms that are already out there in American society, and how can we, through a think tank or something else, develop policies that will inflame those things? So, yeah, I think there's something, it's not a conspiracy, but there's something behind it that is pushing, I mean, it was sort of like, immigrants are not the cause of high house prices in the United States, which has been asserted in these national debates. I mean, to me, that is just, no, it's not immigrants. It's the fact that the banks were given massive amounts of money, free, low interest loans, and they had nowhere else to put it except they put it into asset prices. But here, immigrants are being blamed. So, yeah, there's a lot of these factors that are kind of pushing the pot to boil a little bit. And, you know, there's fundamentalism in every one of the religious traditions. You know, whether it's Christian, Islamic, Jewish, you will find fundamentalist versions of each of those, and you'll also find beautiful versions of each of those as well.
María, what would you make of, in a situation like in Brazil, they did turn to Bolsonaro, but they didn't stay with him very long. So what's your sense, and also, Ayça, in Turkey, there's been Erdogan was really popular, his popularity is waning. So it seems like, although large numbers of people may turn to and elect authoritarian leaders, if they don't deliver, like the democracies didn't deliver, they also lose their allure. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think the case of Brazil is in Latin America, I think the most recent, most poignant one. But then again, going back to El Salvador, citizens were mostly okay with the president changing the constitution to allow him to run again. And something that, I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts is, it seems to me, and I'm not a scholar of authoritarianism, but it seems to me like something that's inherent in these regimes is that the project is not a static one, and it's very dynamic and fluid. And in the case of El Salvador, the first phase, so to speak, was the security aspect. And now he's moved on to the economy and making El Salvador a tech hub, making it a logistics hub, and taking advantage of people like Elon Musk being interested in the country and Bitcoin and Google. So yeah, I'm curious what you have to say about this question.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the project is not static because the world changes and these leaders changes and the alliances that they need to make in the society changes. I mean, in the case of Turkey, like in the beginning, he was supported with this like business faith organization that had the schools in Turkey, had the human capital. When Erdogan was elected, he really depended on this community to recruit bureaucrats, basically. But at one point, their interests start to, clash, and he kind of, Erdogan closed down these schools. That was the main source of, funding for that community, for that faith business group. And they clashed, and then we ended up with this failed coup and then the counter coup. So the project always changes depending on the regional sort of dynamics, the economic dynamics. But I think the brilliance, and I underline this in my talk, is how these leaders can, I mean, Bolsonaro couldn't do that. Like, he couldn't come with an alternative coalition that will bring him back. But Erdogan seems to be doing that, although he has himself and his party is losing votes over time. Now we're back to when he was elected, which is around 30%, 35%. But he still like gets some of these like center-right, like right-wing leaders, which have small vote shares, but still like add up to something that he wins the elections. But one thing that you said is interesting about Elon Musk. I mean, how these leaders, I mean, I think one thing we need to think about when we discuss these things is like these exchanges in between these leaders, how they learn from each other, the people that they look up to in business, like how Erdogan tries to meet Elon Musk. It's like, I mean, this is like it's really like a environment of this business, these strong men doing things, getting things done, kind of like, culture, like how it's like permeated through these societies. That's also really interesting to me. I don't know what you will think about that. How they learn from each other, how like Putin is a good model, or Orban,
I mean, I think it's always been, certainly recognized in the United States that in order for some kind of a democratic republic to work, people had to be informed about, about the way things really are. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. mail, which in the early days of the republic brought newspapers to people. Why there's a newspaper rate, why postage for, publications that were going to convey the news was established as low from the beginning. It has been demonstrated again and again in a variety of ways that false information and misinformation, do not lead to good democratic decision making, even before the digital age. And now in a world of AI, in a world of, in which, a politician can just in a bald-faced way say things that are manifestly untrue and disproven and where there's contradicted by members of their own party. And if you have the right kinds of media networks, news networks, it simply doesn't matter. To this moment, Donald Trump is claiming that there are Haitians eating pets, and when confronted with the fact that there's no evidence of that, so, well, there are news reports of it, which there are, if you call that news, but whatever the motivations of people are, which are legitimate, whether it's in the sense of they have certain religious goals, or they have certain economic concerns, or they're concerned about crime. That all aside, if the information environment is such that they, through whatever combination of choice and victimhood or whatever, are simply misinformed or have come to believe that all information is susceptible to disagreement and therefore I'll pick the one that I want, it simply becomes very, very difficult for people to make choices that are actually in their interest. And the whole democratic project is simply can run aground on that. And it's not because people don't want democracy. One of the things that is most striking about about the apologists for January 6th and the believers in a stolen election is that their claims are, we want honest elections, we want truth, we don't want voting machines being flipped. All of that is in the name of honest elections. At that point, and you say, well, but they are honest, they have been honest, and you have all these people. Well, no, they don't believe that, or they want to not believe that.
Well, that's boy, I'm glad you raised the issue of information, because in my classroom when I'm dealing with students, I'm always talking about sources. Like what, you can't just say 2 people told me that, so it must be true, I hear, well, it's like when you got a presidential candidate saying, well, I saw it on TV, it's like, wow. But on the other hand, it's sort of, I get very nervous when we talk about suppressing hate speech, for example. Who determines what hate speech is? Who determines what misinformation and disinformation? This is a very thorny path to go down. No doubt. Because it's like you were saying about clean elections. They're doing voter suppression in the name of clean elections. Right. You can also do public speech suppression in the name of correcting misinformation. And in some ways, I think some of the people who were sort of anti-vaxxers during COVID, they actually got suppressed. That there was actually suppression from the federal government of certain, what they considered to be disinformation about COVID. And I can see the argument for that, but on the other hand, it's a very dangerous precedent. You think about where information was at, say, in the 19th century in the United States. You had hundreds of thousands of little newspapers, and now with media consolidation, you've got, General Electric, Fox, Rupert Murdoch. You've got Sinclair owning a huge percentage of radio stations in the United States, and they took off the equal time requirement that used to be Yeah, I mean, these are public airwaves, and so there was a rationale for regulating them in the public interest to require equal time, to require local news programming. You know, that was all rolled back since the 1960s and 70s, and so we're in the wake of that. I think we've forgotten how these guardrails came off in the first place. But, you know, at this point, I just tell my students, I go, find multiple sources. I said, you know, right on my smartphone, I've got New York Times, I've got Al Jazeera, I've got Deutsche Welle, I've got German, and I said, you know, I've got RT. I mean, each of those have their different slant, and so, see, this is something that people living in authoritarian societies figured out a long time ago, is that you don't stop reading the propaganda, but you read it against the grain. You know, it's like, oh, who's being dropped this week? How has it changed? And so, because you have the expectation that it's not a free press, and whereas in the United States, a lot of times I think people just would read something and assume it was the truth. They wouldn't read it in a critical way. So this whole issue of how you deal with information, how you get information out, you know, do you come back with hate speech restrictions, and you know what qualifies as that? These are things that are really, we got to think about them pretty damn seriously.
Let me ask you a question. So on the one hand, take before the current media issue, a great example of progressive reform was direct referenda for citizens, and
yes.
So you could, and there are many states that have that, and you know, if you happen to be pro-choice, you know, there are popular referenda out there to overturn very restrictive abortion laws. Fine. At the same time, in a state like California, it has proven to be the case that if you have lots of money,
Yeah.
you can generate lots of, you know, plenty of you know, signatures to get a referendum on the ballot and put all the ads on television and elsewhere to get a self-interested, you know, think about the restrictions on property taxes and so on. So which do you want?
Yeah.
And I think you take the good with the bad, you restrict it in some way. I mean, you know, you got to go both ways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I watched the paid signature gatherer thing come in, because I was the chair of a campaign that was fighting a paid signature campaign to like ban commercial fishing in Washington State. And it was funded by actually oil companies, aluminum industry, developers, as well as some, I think, short-sighted sport fishermen who thought they'd get an advantage if the commercial guys went away. And they came in and they paid guys, you get so much a signature, and those signature gatherers can stand outside and just tell you that this is about something innocuous when it's not. They can just tell a mistruth. And so what we would do is we would actually stand out there with the signature gatherers, and when they would tell a lie, we would say, excuse me, ma'am, there's another side to that story. But then they would call the police on us, you know, because we would get it, because that's considered to be protected activity. And we thought, no, this is a sphere for debate. And so you're right, the money comes in, and so something that's democratic. But I don't know what the well, I'll tell you one alternative is that in Seattle we have these things called democracy vouchers, which is a program in which you can designate, in terms of your city council races, $100 of city money that you would support being sent to this candidate. And so it's like direct funding. But in a way, I still feel like the big winners here are the media companies. And they're taking advantage of the fact that they're using public airwaves, and we're not putting requirements, public interest requirements, on the use of public airwaves. I mean, that'd be another way
to restrict speech?
No, I would say we would put requirements on to open it up to well, we used to have equal time requirements, or even just put a requirement on saying you will have 1 hour of local news coverage every day. You know, that in a sense, we would be subsidizing coverage in a way that's not maybe profitable for them right now. These are just ideas that are out there. The democracy vouchers idea works within the existing system in terms of, you know, buying airtime and so forth. But it's another way that you can get candidates that don't have access to money to get in there.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say, I've noticed in the United States, if you want to get into politics, you need to have money. In Latin America, and I don't know about Russia and Turkey, we've seen many leaders get into politics to enrich themselves. And I think of Venezuela, Nicaragua, those leaders or dictators, whatever we want to call them, they and their inner circles are so rich, have enriched themselves at the expense of their populations who don't have access to basic goods in many cases. So that's something that I've noticed is that difference, and I'm wondering what impact that has on authoritarian leaders being able to stay and being able to perpetuate their regimes and subject their people to that form of government.
Yeah,
I've never
wanna
had
take a
any
break.
presidents who've made money from the job.
Excuse me, we've, I hate to stop this conversation, but I wanted to reserve some time for the audience, and so we've actually ended their time right now. So let's give them a chance. Anybody have a question or want to engage with the panel on the subjects that they've been talking about? Please go up to the microphone.
Geron, you began with allegiance, a question about allegiance, and Mark picked up on that, I think. What's the prospect that we need a super allegiance, given that we are stuck on a planet that's in danger of becoming uninhabitable, so that we focus on a superordinate goal rather than all this foolishness of intergroup and interreligious and international intrigues in which we seem to become embroiled as well as interested? Is there any value in that? That's why I'm here passing out earth pins. I think we need allegiance to the planet before international or MAGA or other kinds of subordinate allegiances. Is there any merit to that thought? What do you all think? Thank you.
Well, I'm thinking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was put into effect by the UN after the disaster of the Second World War, you know, and these are supranational principles, which I believe are, you know, and I guess we could probably now also incorporate ecological salvation as one of those goals should be put in there, along with all those other rights that are enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, people have tried to use those in, say, courts in the United States, and usually, well, sometimes juries will say, yeah, you know, you're trumping our law, but you're doing it for a broader cause. So, yeah, I think it's important to have supranational sort of guidance or just goals that we all subscribe to, you know, as opposed to the narrow nationalistic sort of divisions that we're ensconced in.
I mean, the most recent example of what you're talking about, I think I would say, is the 2015 Paris Accords, which did result, I mean, which involved a huge amount of work, bringing all those nations together to come to an agreement, which was, you know, short of what one would want and what we need as a planet to deal with climate change, but was a very signal accomplishment with a lot of religious buy-in, incidentally. That was before the election of Donald Trump. It was before, I think, Bolsonaro's election. It was, you know, I think over the 9 years since then, things have turned in the wrong direction. But we don't have to go all the way back to the Human Rights Agreement Declaration to have seen examples of that. But American leadership is pretty important in the world, and it took that leadership in terms of supranational agreements of the sort you have in mind. You know, we went through 4 years of America First, and we're now in an election in which the sort of push towards some kind of autarky is embraced by, you know, half the population. I mean, look at the tariff proposals that are on the table, for example. I mean, they may, any economist and most, you know, businessmen regard them as insane, but that's the platform. I mean, you'd have to go back to Smoot-Hawley and the Depression to get those kinds of proposals being put on the table by, one can say it, the Republican Party.
Well, and to your point about information, Donald Trump was just interviewed, I think, last week by Bloomberg on the tariffs plan, and now there are mega tariffs too that he's put on the table. And the understanding, the way that he's explaining to the public what these tariffs are, which is not how they work, is, you know, it's just out there without being, nobody's pushing back. And you see the Bloomberg, which is a very reputable source, the clip is just like sound bites are just going viral. And it's like, if he said this on Bloomberg, then he must understand how tariffs work really well. And that's so dangerous, because that's not how they work.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the information thing, not necessarily answer to your question, but that's really interesting, like how this information sort of sphere just like confuses people, you know. Like, I mean, in the old like dictatorships, you know, old style authoritarianism, like this idea was like you cut the information so that people don't know. Now it's like we have so much information, but we can't figure out what is going on because we have so much like you know, different sources. It just confuses people, you know. And I think the leaders use information in very, I wouldn't say like good, but like really clever ways. I mean, there was a book, maybe you've read it. It was called, I think, Spin Dictators, which is like, you know, how new autocrats are trying to confuse people and give spin to things rather than, you know, cutting that information. Although cutting information also does happen. Like in Turkey, we have weeks of like, you know, states just closing down Instagram altogether, or Twitter or YouTube, you know, because some sort of information is coming out that, you know, they don't want. And they do it to protect the public from misinformation, which is like this misinformation laws. But it's like, I mean, mostly serving to keep people, like, what people know under control. So they're doing both, I guess, like in these authoritarian.
Well, look at the TikTok issue in the United States. That, you know, they're trying to force TikTok to either sell off their ownership to the United States. They're concerned about that sort of chaotic, uncontrolled flow of information around the edges of social media, because it undermines maybe the official narrative or the dominant narrative. So it's interesting.
Yeah, when there's so much like information, the normative things that we should think about and focus, they're just like lost in the noise, you know. And I think you were trying to underline the loss of those norms as like, you know, universal norms, if you like. Now that America is kind of edging towards, I don't know where it's edging, other for other nations, even there's like the idea of democracy is degrading. It's not like the practice of democracy itself, but is the norm of democracy, some sort of liberal democracy. And unfortunately, Europeans are not doing a very good job either. I mean, you said that, Europeans are all welcoming immigrants and stuff, but it's not the case. I mean, they do all kinds of tricks, like if you look at the UK, like paying some African country to get their immigrants, or European Union, like cutting deals with Turkey to keep Syrians from coming in. I mean, those are very immoral things, you know. They're not like, liberal democracies should not do that. Right, especially when there are international agreements where they have to open their doors to people who are under risk, but they're not doing that. They instead just, subcontract some poor nation or nation which needs money. So we're losing those norms, unfortunately, and thanks to, I mean, it's interesting that the West still has this sort of moral dominance. They think they have the moral dominance, but I think from the rest of the world that moral dominance is not a very deserved place, because like what's going on in Gaza now, right? Like, how are we gonna restore any kind of belief in the international system when this is happening? It's hard. Like, how are you gonna convince Turks or Chinese or Iranians that, it's actually things are under control and these are the norms and we follow it up? No, I mean, these are all like experiences of the world that like damages people's sense of fairness, sense of order, sense of like higher moral, status. So.
I just want to say one quick thing in response to your question is that I think we truly live in an age where nothing is true and everything is possible. And I think that that's maybe the largest stumbling block when, a large majority of Americans, or a significant number of Americans, I don't know if it's a majority, don't believe in human-caused climate change, or if people elsewhere on the planet fight against it. And so I think, going back to something Pete said, like education and information literacy and thinking about, moral posturing, as you were just saying, are all really important to combating global problems. I mean, look at the disasters that just happened in the southeast of the United States. I mean, these happened in states that are traditionally right-leaning, anti-government states, and now they're relying on, FEMA and other federal aid to piece things together. Meanwhile, you see posts online that people are saying, well, all the money's going to Ukraine or to Israel, and we're not getting any help down here, and it's just not true. And so combating falsehoods, combating information illiteracy, I think are the biggest issues.
We have about 2 minutes left. Another question?
I guess it's a question. Maybe it's a comment. So as a Catholic, a paid-up member of a supranational organization that's all over the world, first a comment. We came late to the democracy table, dragged kicking and screaming by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the 19th and 20th centuries, to a place, though, where in the last, around the same time as the Voting Rights Act with the Second Vatican Council, came to see democracy as embodying two key elements of Catholic social teaching, which I would suggest might be another perspective on democracy that I'd kind of throw out to you. The first is the priority of human dignity, and the second is the priority of the common good and working for the common good. And that democracy, with all of its flaws and failings and everything else, appears to be one of the best ways to somehow uphold human dignity and achieve the common good. because you bring in so many different groups and peoples and everything. I guess my question would be, we talk about democracy as if democracy is somehow a thing, that has a substance to it, where I think our perspective would be more, we would view democracy in much more functional terms. And here I am speaking for the entire Catholic Church, but looking at it in terms of as more instrumentally, that is how democracy moves us towards bigger goals. In our case, are looking at it, upholding human dignity and working together for the common good at whatever level we're talking about. So I guess I would, I get my comment would be, how would you see maybe a way or another way or some different ways of reframing how we think about democracy? And also how that might help us in our next episode here in defending democracy.
Let me say one thing very quickly.
Can I just?
Sure.
Let's
We've
leave
run out
that
of
for the
time.
next panel.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. We're actually over our time. Thank you, Control Room, for giving us a little extra time. Wonderful question and a great opportunity you've provided to the panel. The next panel will take it up. So you can start with that. I think that's a wonderful starting point. All right, that's all the time we have for this
That
panel.
was a panel
Thank you all
discussion
for
on
your
the nature
attention
of
and
authoritarian movements. It was recorded October 19th, 2024 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlingit Ani as part of the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. Produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine,